Hello, and welcome to the Wednesday, November 21st edition of the Cluster API subgroup meeting for SIG Cluster Lifecycle. We have a couple things on the agenda today, and we'll just dive right in. The first is there's a PR that got opened about namespacing the machine annotation. It's number 593. And it effectively just adds a prefix to the existing annotation key to make it clear that the annotation belongs to the Cluster API. So this looked fine to me, but I wanted to bring it up here since it is sort of a change to the quote API, if you will, just to make sure nobody had objections or was depending upon that in a way that this would break before we took the hold off and merged it. So it looks like it was discussed during the EMEA provider implementation meeting this morning, because I saw a couple of thumbs up get added. So I just wanted to bring it up here also and see if anyone objected before we remove the hold.
So generally, what kind of API prefixes and API groups are you using or are you allocating with this project?
So the API group that we're using, I think, is cluster.k8s.io, which is the same prefix that got added to this annotation. So it's consistent.
Yeah, as long as that keeps consistent, I'm fine.
Okay. If anyone has objections, please comment on the PR or in chat, and if not, we'll remove the hold at the end of the meeting. All right, next, Daniel, the number 548, renaming ProviderConfig to ProviderSpec.
Yeah, so first of all, sorry I've been missing in action for a few weeks, and I still haven't found the time to try basically moving like the GCP provider, for example, to use this let's say off of my own, like a cluster API with these changes off my own repo, for example. But that was now I'm wondering, if it's really necessary. If it is, then I will try to find time. I think I can find some time next week. But if it's not, then perhaps we can make the change, and providers, vendoring the repo will just need to make those changes when they move to the to a new hash of cluster API.
So we discussed this, I think, 2 weeks ago, if you look back on the notes, and David mentioned that the Gitbook documentation already assumed that this PR has merged. And I know at least one person has pinged me saying, I can't find the provider spec, where is it? And I had to put in ProviderConfig and your issue and saying, it hasn't been renamed yet, here's what you're looking for. But I think David also mentioned, reading back through the notes, that he suggested that we wait until you actually have a chance to do a bit more testing. And there were some sort of broader conversations about how much we wanted people to do testing before merging things, and in terms of assuring compatibility and stuff. So I think I saw it yet. David, do you want to chime in and reiterate any of those thoughts?
You're muted, David.
You're still muted.
Sorry, I won't repeat the whole thing, but what I was going to say is that the fact that people are reading the Gitbook and running the problems makes me think this is more urgent to merge. I do agree that most providers check in their vendor directory, and so it probably won't break them. But there are providers that run dep ensure unconditionally every time they build, and it will break them immediately. So how do we feel about it? I don't know.
Do the providers that do dep ensure on the fly, I mean, how are they going to deal with any, I mean, they're going to break any time a change gets merged upstream.
Yes.
That like changes, you know, package imports or changes an internal interface or anything else too, right?
So arguably they're already in a bad state. I agree.
Yeah. Or they're in a fragile state, right? Like maybe it's the state they want to be in. Maybe it's not necessarily bad, right? But it's definitely fragile.
Yeah, I'm okay with merging it.
So have you seen, I'm also in favor of merging it, but have you seen as we go like in the future, there's coming this CRD conversion, CRD conversion, API conversions with webhook support. So might be that we want to build some small webhook application that we can point to.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons we want to get this in now while we're still alpha and telling people the API is unstable is that we don't have to go through those extra hoops. Yes, once we sort of settle down and we're sort of promising more around compatibility, then we're going to be relying on conversion logic to ensure that compatibility if we need to make these sorts of changes.
And also it's good to mention that you can still, so say you release, so what we've done in Kubernetes is that we've treated our every alpha API as beta. So we're like kind of ahead of the curve. So we've changed fields as we've gone through this year. But still we've made all those changes or like backwards compatible in the sense that Kubernetes that supports Alpha 2, for example, can still read Alpha 1 and internally convert directly to Alpha 2. So that as you release the first Alpha 1, you can still make the cluster API controller understand the CRD of Alpha 1, although you bump the new spec to Alpha 2. So that's the big benefit of using this component config pattern.
At one point, looking at the release notes for 1.13, it looked like kubeadmin was claiming that it's going to drop support for reading the v1 alpha 3 in the following release. So right now you'll read v1 alpha 3, but starting with 1.14, you'll only read the beta versions,
yes.
right? Okay.
Yes.
So you're just maintaining a small window of backwards compatibility, so you don't end up with lots and lots of code debt for all the old versions, it sounds like.
Right. So we have like only the next to latest, like the previously supported version and the now supported latest version. So then you always can upgrade as you go. Like I could upgrade my Alpha 1 to Beta 1 through Alpha 2, 3 by just updating Kubernetes.
Right, and I think what you said is that is ahead of the curve in the sense that it's not actually expected or required for alpha APIs, right?
Yes,
so
it's not required.
So we can decide if we want to do that as well.
Yeah, I think it makes sense from a use perspective. So
does that imply you guys haven't made like drastically breaking changes to the configuration? It's just more of reshuffling where fields live?
We've made super breaking changes, a lot of them, but we still made it like so that I can, however many breaking changes there are, I can, the newest version of Kubernetes can always read the previous supported configuration. So if you have a cluster API 0.1 that has alpha 1, and then in 0.2 you release alpha 2, you can then in 0.2 still read alpha 1. But once you get to 0.3, you drop support for alpha 1.
Yeah, so I understand that. I'm just wondering, like, if you wanted to like drastically restructure the API, I guess what you're saying is you're not restructuring it in such a way that it's impossible to convert, right? In all cases, it's possible to convert up to the new one. And maybe that's some fancy defaulting and ignoring of fields that no longer apply.
So one thing we, for example, did was we split the monolith master configuration into init configuration in one YAML document and cluster configuration in another YAML document. So like that is a super breaking change. Because nothing is like the same, not the kinds. Now we have two YAML documents, but it's still convertible if you write some extra code. So I think most things are upgradable unless you obviously drastically remove half of the fields you have in the new version.
Yeah, I guess I'd put that under, that's like a big restructuring of sort of where everything lives, but it's not actually changing sort of your internal representation necessarily of the fields you expect to get. It's just where you get them from. And I think that's a pretty straightforward case to do conversion.
Yeah, right. So so obviously if you drastically change the contract of what is expected to be provided, then you might have problems. Like the user manual needs to go and fill in some net new configuration. But I think most of the cases you should be kind of fine. But yeah, just things to think about as we go toward production readiness.
All right, let's move on to the next thing on the agenda, which is Hardick's PR for machine phases.
Hi. So I had created this PR for machine phases quite some time back, and I can already see there are a lot of comments on that. And I just wanted to have a quick check that what we understood out of this is correct. So what I can see is that in general, in the proposal, I have basically made type. So I basically defined the type for the phases, and that's where I guess the suggestion is that we basically keep it as open string so that it can just evolve and not basically type it out. Is that the correct understanding? Or I guess I just wanted to confirm it over the call with Alvaro or someone else is in the call. So, and also on the last operation. So basically I have made a comment that the entire approach boils down in following ways. So we have one approach where either we can have specific fields defined by us where we can explicitly mention that what's the state or the phase of the machine, which we can control based on our own use cases, where we can include draining, standby, and whatnot. And the other approach could be that we only provide the node reference, and we expect that. Basically by a node reference also we can infer most of the states and phases that the higher level controllers basically has to read the node reference, go to the node object, and derive necessary. So these are basically two parallel approaches, and just wanted to know which one is preferred and where should we go ahead, if anyone has more views.
Yeah, so maybe I can say a little about that because I commented a lot on this PR. So my main concern with it is and was that it feels a lot like it's actually adding some kind of API into the status. And this is something I would really like to avoid because it will be hard to evolve. Other than that, a lot of the information that will be put there can be derived from the existing node reference. And I would really like to avoid that we duplicate the heartbeat mechanism, which is basically something higher level controllers need. And that can cause a lot of issues. What some people brought up inside the pull request that it would be very useful to have some way to basically put a status on the machine object in order to display it in the UI or something the like. Yeah, and that's where the idea of like just making it untyped strings came from. Yeah.
Okay. So for phases, maybe we can maybe make it untyped. I think I don't see any concerns either of the way. So mainly the learnings came from when I looked at the types of the Kubernetes, and I could see that for the pods, also for a very basic set of because there was evolving thing happened there. But for us, what we can probably do is that we can keep it untyped, keep it open as a string, and then let the status be evolved just that way. Will that be okay? So I was just wondering, then I can maybe make the necessary changes on the PR and keep it going. So if we remove the type where I have explicitly mentioned that machine phase pending, machine phase running, and so on, so maybe we can remove those and make a string and keep it open. If that sounds good.
Yeah, for me that would be fine. I don't know what other people think.
Okay.
I think it would be fine too. I'm really torn on this because I feel like it's implicit spec or status is really hard to consume as a user, but I'm also sympathetic to the idea that we should not be recreating node health checks and heartbeats and everything like that. It's just too hard. And it's inconsistent, so.
Okay. So yeah, so I'll take a look again. There was quite some time buffer in between. I was involved here and there, but I'll take a look again. I will make the changes that way. Then I'll make it for open string rather than having a typed phases. And if you see a need of having typed phases, probably in the future, then we can anyway introduce them, right? So it's there anyway. So I'll then make the necessary changes there on the PR. Cool.
Yeah.
If there are anyone else has any views that, yeah.
Just one question about, so the concern about duplicating health checks, is it really true that we would have to duplicate health checks? I mean, wouldn't this sort of be like conditions where we have some process that periodically looks at the node health checks and just copies that information over into a different field in the status? So there's no actual logic to do health checks. There's just logic to copy the implicit data and make it explicit.
Yes. So if the question is me, yes. So I was of the opinion that we would be basically learning not only from the node, but in case in future if we see the things coming from the node problem detector and so on. So it will also be possible that from there also we will see some kind of signals coming. So all those information which are going to be used by the higher level machine controllers could be put at one place and then that can be consumed from there. That was the picture that I'm looking at. So node could be one of the resources where we already get a lot of information like disk pressure, memory pressure, kubelet ready, not ready, and all those available already.
So I will first say something to what David said and then go on to the next. Regarding just copying info over, this has, in my opinion, two huge drawbacks. First off, it won't happen if the controller is not up for whatever reason. And second off, one big issue with this node health checking is that basically the whole object that's at the end of the day stored in the etcd gets a new revision even if you just update it as timestamp. And that creates a lot of issues, which is basically why in Kubernetes itself, it's currently in the process of being moved outside of the node object itself and in a dedicated API group, if I recall correctly. And regarding using more sources than the nodes itself for the health checking, do you have a sample of what such a source could be?
Yes. So for example, in the case of NPD, right? So we could have different kinds of signals coming from the NPD where agents are running on the machine. So at the moment, NPD also works in a way that NPD can directly put the conditions on the node. So it could be then coming from there either, or for the so they basically define it into temporary problems and permanent problems. So the permanent problems will be represented via the conditions on the nodes, but the temporary problems would basically be an event on the API server where we could assume in a way that if there are some kind of problems which could somehow resolve by taking the remedy controller's help, then those kind of things would be coming either as an event or some other means. So if possible, then we could also aggregate that kind of events and somehow make it available on the machine object, saying that following machine is facing some kind of temporary problem, or this could be, and that could be also one of the way of explicitly mentioning the details outside, which could be again useful for the UI purposes or any other purposes.
I feel like it's a bit more logical to keep all node conditions on the node object. Yeah.
Okay, so so the main question that I had was about the phases being typed and making it untyped, if that's okay. And it seems like if it's okay, then maybe I'll make the necessary changes on the PR, and then we can have a look on it again, right?
Okay. Jason also had quite a few comments on your proposal, Hardik, and he's not here today. So we should definitely try to sync up with him and make sure he is okay with the way we're moving forward here as well.
So I guess I had a call with the Jason on the day when we had approved, and I think the concern also was on a similar lines, that maybe keeping it typed may be a blocker for evolving it further. So, but I'll check with him again, and anyway we'll tag him again since I will make the changes so that he can also have a quick look on it. Yeah, but in general, I just wanted to make sure that we should have machine phase kind of field available there, right? So if that's possible, then we can decide on the implementation part whether we need types or we need to keep it open. So that's the second question. Okay, thanks.
All right, so the next two things I stuck in here were just issues that I found looking through the issue backlog that I thought would be worth discussing briefly. The first one Chuck opened about splitting machines into multiple YAML documents and adding more flags to cluster cuddle. And David responded that he dislikes how many options we already have to pass to cluster cuddle. And I would sort of, well, before I put my opinion out there, what do other people think about this? I'm not sure how many people actually look at the issue backlog, so it's worth bringing some stuff up here so people can get some thoughts and eyes on them.
So this is only about cluster.ctl.
Yes, yeah, right now if you're on cluster.ctl, you have to pass at least 3, maybe 4 flags to it, one of which is a file that contains your machine definitions.
Yeah. I see Chuck's point, and I think it could make sense. That said, like you're gonna need component config at some point. I don't know if you've seen my latest proposal, but I just linked it there in last of the doc. So basically, I run a KubeCon talk on how to implement component config, and it's to a large extent what you already do, and it's like nothing magical, just like this set of conventions from reading config from disk. I think if you're getting to the state where flags are getting painful, you should sooner rather than later support just reading from a config with kind whatever cluster CTL specification, or I don't know what you want to call it, but like the inputs to cluster CTL for creating a cluster. That's like the first thing that pops up in my head. And with that in place, I think it does make sense to split those two if you have this kind of ordering. Like first you need to create N machines, and after that you need to create these M machines. So if you have that very specific boundary or like limitation, it probably makes sense to expose that restriction to the user as well, or caller.
Yeah, I mean, I think if we step back and look at the bigger problem of the fact that we have like 3 command line flags right now, which point to 3 different YAML files, I feel like we could sort of even consolidate those all into a single YAML file separated with dashes, or just have the cluster cuddle tool read a directory and be able to sort of parse and split apart the YAML files in code instead of having the human have to split them apart and pass multiple flags. And if we need to hint to the code exactly how to split them apart, we can do things like use annotations. But I would sort of love to see us reduce the number of flags rather than add new flags.
Do we need to create user nodes as part of the bring up? Or can we get away with the control plane?
So it's provider specific. In our implementation, we can apply the control plane and the workers at the same time, and the actuator will just skip any work on the workers until it finds that the control plane is configured. I could also imagine providers that don't have any control plane machines at all, right? They're hosted.
I do like the, Robbie, your idea of the directory, right? I feel like, I guess this gets into, I think, what the next item on the agenda is, which is Lucas's one about add-ons, right? I feel like there will be other things which, some bucket of other things you want to install on the cluster, maybe, as managed by cluster CTL. And I don't think we want to have kubedns or DNS manifest and networking manifest and like a series of flags for that. So I think a bucket where we just say like, put all your stuff in this directory and off you go. And then ideally we'd put the user machine deployment in that bucket, because I would hope it wouldn't matter, but if it did matter, maybe we could just put it in that bucket. Maybe we could even put the master in that same bucket. I don't know if there's any reason to delineate the master.
So so I think that makes sense. What would maybe also make sense is to support the case of multiple YAML files. As said, in Kubernetes we had this monolith struct with like just key value pairs, and we split this up to now in beta 2 distinct kinds. One that is only for runtime information, just use once, and one that is persisted in the cluster for like more this cluster level config. And we separate those with YAML documents, and you also can specify component configs for the proxy and the kubelet down the road in the same config file. And I don't know how much you've been thinking about customize, but if you have this like these tens of different add-ons you want to apply and like 15 different mutations and patches and stuff, anyway, instead of doing templating on your directory, you have then just pull them together using customize. Customize will give you in separate YAML documents, and off you go to pipe it into cluster CTL.
How much of this is implemented today with API?
How do you mean?
Sorry, this sounds like a great idea to me. I would, it would unblock me if it was already in open source somewhere.
So like, what are you talking about? Kubernetes or customize?
Well, I know customize is there, but like integrating that into Kubernetes.
I think you should be able to use customize.
Oh, it sounded like you were saying. Sorry.
So Ben the Elder already implemented customize into kind, and you can ask him about feedback for that. My only concern was that customize vendors the whole AWS SDK. And yeah, they have plans to remove it to basically.
Yeah, that's like the cloud provider thing. Yes.
Well, it isn't the full AWS SDK, but it is a surprisingly large subset. I guess we do have I don't want to like rattle on this. Like we have to figure out whether we would prefer, like I could write an S3 fetcher. The question is, do we want to maintain our own versus like vendoring the subset of the AWS SDK that does that? Which is and
mainly just splitting the packages in a way that we don't have to vendor it. Right.
the AWS SDK ones? You mean to minimize the?
Yeah, like customize shouldn't depend on the SDK just because it vendors Kubernetes.
By the way, there's currently a PR that enables customizing kubectl as well. So that's where yes. I started basically complaining about the AWS bits, and they promised that they're going to refactor it because of that.
Yeah, right. So that we should have no SDKs for whatever cloud in core Kubernetes nor customize. But right now we do have in GoDeps, which is on its way out. But as it goes out, we need, with regards to add-ons, and that's why I'm asking, we need this like on initialization time cloud controller manager for AWS. Then if you're running there, needs to be set up and initialized directly, etc., etc., etc. So I like the, instead of having, when I said the thing about flags and do a component config from flags, I hadn't looked at clusterctl, that command. So when it's just other YAML files, it definitely makes sense to just support this mega YAML file, or that is all the kinds in different YAML documents, or this folder.
ये देख लेते हैं ना? नहीं, मेरा तेरा हॉटस्पॉट ट्रेन.
Okay.
Sorry?
I think that was just background noise. Prashant, if there's something you wanted to say, you can unmute yourself again. I think in the interest of time, we should move on to the next thing on the agenda. But it sounds like people have quite a few thoughts here, so I would encourage you to go and add some of those onto the issue, the linked issue number 594. And I'll try to do the same. Next, I want to talk about 556, which was an issue that Jason opened, about providing a way to exclude resources when pivoting a cluster. And in particular, the AWS provider has a use case where they have a secret they want to put into the bootstrapping cluster, but not have it automatically pivoted into the target cluster. I feel like there have been at least one or two other cases where we've run across something similar, where there's resources that we want to put into one place or the other. Like, I guess add-ons is the opposite, where I added an extra flag to cluster to say, here's some add-ons, which are things that we only want to put in the target cluster and not the bootstrapping cluster. So I think we sort of have two buckets, or three, I guess. One bucket of things that should go both places, one bucket of things that only go in the bootstrapping cluster, and a bucket of things that only go in the target cluster. So I don't know if people have thoughts about how we might want to specify this. It's sort of related to the last conversation of we can separate things out into flags, because different flags or different configuration files are one way to signal to the tool which bucket these things fall into. We could do things like annotations to signal to the tool which bucket things fall into with some reasonable defaults. And there's probably some other ways to tackle this too. So I don't know if people have thoughts about that one.
It seems fair enough to support it for symmetry. I'm unconvinced on the AWS use case, but I don't object to the feature.
Yeah, I can probably speak to the AWS use case. It's if people running cluster cuddle on their machine with the Minikube, then they're going to have some explicit AWS credentials that we're feeding in as a secret. On the target cluster, we want to leverage IAM instance profile, so we don't actually want the secret there anymore.
Because I thought, yeah, it's because it's on the Minikube rather than on a sort of, okay. I thought you were spinning up a temporary AWS machine to then do it, but yeah, it makes sense if it's on Minikube. That makes sense. Got it.
I think the feature is okay and good. I'm just struggling right now to think about how to expose it in the API, because
don't have to solve it right now either. I did just want to bring it up as here's an issue people haven't really commented too much on. Please take a look. It sounds like there's some consensus that this is a reasonable feature request, which I agree with. It's just a question of how we expose it to users, right? Or how much we can hide it from users. I think is really the the thing we want to iterate on. And again, we don't have to solve it in this meeting, but I do want people to start thinking about it. Nadir, did you have something you were going to say?
No, not really. It just seems like the options are flags or annotations, and I've got no opinion on that.
Okay, I was hoping there might be another option I hadn't thought of. Those are the only two I can think of.
Okay, next one. Should I just read it out louder?
Yes, go ahead and you can try the next couple since they're all from you.
Okay, yeah. So yeah, I've been out for a while, as you know, and I'm just thinking like, okay, now I'm back and want to know what are we doing with add-ons and cluster API and how do they relate, especially when we start talking about the cluster bundles formal KEP proposal thing. Do we right now just do this like kubectl apply one-off for resources and go with that and say that is add-ons for cluster API, or do we do something more fancy?
I would suggest you come listen to Justin's talk at KubeCon without giving it away.
Obviously planning to, and the contributors summit, but
What is
what's the current state?
What is this KEP you're talking about? Cluster bundle KEP.
The KEP you're going to write, right?
Yeah, that's fair. I think actually, so cluster bundles are actually open sourced on Google Cloud Platform. It's Kate- something.
Can you link it?
I could, if I could remember how to spell it.
It's almost certainly in the notes. It's almost certainly in the notes from last week because we talked about it last week.
Actually, found it.
In the main meeting.
Here it is.
Thanks.
And we should be able to use that to install a bundle of things, to specify the bundle that we want to install. And we might be able to move between bundles by saying a new bundle should be installed. We don't yet have a way to actuate the update, but like we could use today's add-on manager would work, right? Which just pulls a source directory and applies kubectl applies the changes, or kubectl applies it all, and therefore like updates it with the changes.
Yeah, but what's the current state? Like this add-ons YAML you can supply to cluster CTL. Is it just doing kubectl apply everything post?
Yes. Yes. So right now it's kind of like what kubeadium does, which is after it pivots to the target cluster, it just kubectl applies everything you've specified in that add-ons YAML file, which is fine for bootstrapping. It's not necessarily great for cluster management going forward. Right, and so that was put in there specifically to get things like storage classes in the target cluster, which is something that we were interested in getting set up because that's not sort of there by default. But yeah, it's not intended to be the long-term solution. It was intended to be a quick patch we could stick in to unblock ourselves.
I realize we can talk, given that the talk is public, we can talk about the idea that what we're doing in some places is operators. So we're going to use operators to manage that, and you could, so an operator would be a much better solution for how to do that than the current add-on manager. And so that is what I can talk about so far. Because unless someone has more information in the summary, but yes.
Justin, are you allowed to talk about, so I think we've got a use case where, say you want to install a CNI and that requires some other AWS changes, I open up some security groups. Is there a concept of like cloud provider specific resources in the bundle?
We actually do not have that. We don't even have that in the bundle today. when we did a POC in COPS where COPS sort of was like had that logic hard coded, which is not a good situation, but might be. I think it'd be nice to specify that information in the bundle and have, I guess in this, it would still be hard coded logic, but it would pick up the information from the bundle. So that in theory you could change that. It gets a little weird if you think about where it's being applied. Like, is it being applied on the cluster or is it being applied by cluster CTL? And like, if it's being applied on the cluster, who has permissions to change security groups? Was it security groups? So that is a tricky update. The changing of that is a particularly tricky update. But I think if the list of security groups was somehow encoded in the bundle, that would be a better solution than what we have in the current POC in COPS, which just sort of says, oh, this is Calico, so it needs like this map.
Did Justin freeze for everybody else, or is it just me?
He froze for me as well.
Okay.
Let's see if he comes back.
Have we sort of answered your question about add-ons and cluster bundles? I think the answer with cluster bundles is it doesn't relate yet because we're not using them in the cluster API. Justin is experimenting with using them in COPS. I would love to start experimenting with using them in the cluster API as well, because I think it, in the similar sense of what we were talking about before with lots of different YAML files and splitting them across directories, the cluster bundle is an attempt to sort of pull a lot of those pieces together. We've also talked about the cluster bundle in relationship to, there's a proposal to consolidate the bootstrapping scripts across providers. And the cluster bundle has a facility to actually embed sort of a node startup piece that we'd expect to run on nodes. So we've looked at integrating it there as well. So it's right now it is a sort of separate thing that we've open sourced from Google's side. There's a guy named Josh at Google who was here last week that was talking about it, and he's the main driver from our end there. And I think he would love to see it start to get some adoption across tools. And I think that the biggest benefit there is that the bundle itself is really just a schema for describing the different pieces, and each tool can put what they feel like is most important into that schema. But if we have a common way to describe those things, and that moves us towards more consistent logic across the board in terms of our different cluster management tools. And then I think we answered your question about add-ons, which is today it's like kubeadmin with just a kubectl apply, but we'd like to move towards something a little bit more actively managed.
And I think there's one other piece which is great in the bundle, which might be useful for, I guess, 2 conversations ago, which is, I believe the current, it's going a lot, I'm doing a lot of refactoring, but I believe the current metaphor is a bundle is a set of components, and each component is essentially a manifest with some extra stuff. But one of those extra pieces is that you can add some metadata to the components to say like which control plane it should, whether it's like the target cluster or the whatever the Minikube one. So maybe help with the pivot and not pivoting. Maybe.
Okay, and I just like expect this is the CRD or similar, and then you have this bundle operator or whatever that is applying the right set of things to the API server and like doing the loop.
Yeah, that would be cool. I think that is a good way to do it.
Okay, so it's not doing it right now.
You should come to the talk, Lucas.
For the bundle specifically, though, the answer is no. I don't think that the bundle repo has a bundle operator. I think it's more just a schema.
Yeah, you're not. I think we like the idea of operators, but the bundle itself doesn't force you to use an operator to apply it. If you would prefer to write a bash script, you are welcome to do so.
Yeah, I'm just thinking from the context of the core community, right? So, like, we say that we install the bundle operator in kubeadm, and then everything else is referenced via a bundle and like thing. So you can then in the kubeadm config, you can reference the bundle set, for example, and add bundle packages if you wanted to, or reference other bundle packages from. And on upgrade, you can reference a new bundle. I'm just like these kind of things. Like, could it be converted into something that the community could adopt, so that like the cluster API could automatically by default use it? Because if you use Kubernetes, for example, then it's already there, and you just spec through the packages and sets.
I think that was the hope that Josh had for the bundle, was that it could be a common way to describe these things, and we could use it at the different layers of tooling to make it easier to A, move your configuration between those different pieces of tooling, and B, have the tooling communicate with each other in a more consistent way.
Right. And with Customize, you can also, like, if you have this kind of templating thing or need this patch overriding thing, you can start with your director with every environment, then feed it through Customize, then through Kubernetes or Cluster API, and it will all flow down to the desired state. Okay, cool. That's what I wanted to know.
Yeah, and Customize is great because it helps avoid sort of flag proliferation, right? So you don't necessarily have to plumb through a flag for everything anymore, because you can say, that's pretty niche, go use Customize.
Yeah, exactly. So it also kind of answered the next question I had. How detailed should a cluster kind be? And with this, we're saying that addons are completely separate. We're just thinking about the core. Still, it's not clear to me, are we gonna, so now Kubernetes has made greater than before compatibility like guarantees on its configuration API. We've decided on as small as if we could get it, field set on what is the desired state of the cluster that Kubernetes cares about. So I was just thinking, like, are you trying to like do as little as possible and just put everything in ProviderConfig for now, or ProviderSpec now, or are you waiting for the community to find the thing that everybody needs? Is that still the case?
I mean, I can say what I would hope, which is that we don't put it in the ProviderSpec at all, but we put it into like that bucket, that directory, whatever it is. Like, first of all, we shouldn't have that many other things, but where we do, it's not even in the ProviderSpec. Like, maybe the ProviderSpec would reference a bundle.
Okay, so you will keep the cluster spec very lightweight. Is that what you're saying? Or
that's my personal hope. I don't know how others feel.
So I have a question. Right now, the machine actuator depends on the cluster. There's almost no information in the cluster except for pod and service siders. And in particular, for hosted environments, I don't even think you need that information. Cluster registry also has a cluster kind, and the only information it has is the API endpoint. I'm not sure what the value of the current cluster object is. And so I think I've said too much. I'd like to back up and ask, what do people use the cluster object for, other than the endpoint, which is, I think, the only thing I use it for?
The main thing that I see being put in the cluster object is the shared like network configuration across the cluster. So you say, like, here is the range of addresses that I want to allocate for pods or services or so forth. And having a single place to put that. There's nowhere really in a machine definition that you can put that information. And when you're allocating those things, you need to have a place to pull them from. The other thing I've seen it used for in some provider implementations, if there are like shared secrets or shared information, that need to be used across all the nodes, for instance, so that not having to replicate that information in all of the nodes, but instead consolidating it into the cluster object, so that whenever a new node needs to be created, the user doesn't have to re-specify like, oh, here are the credentials for that node. It's stored in one place and maybe with different rules about who can access it, but the node controller can still get that information and create new nodes. So those are sort of the two use cases I've seen for the cluster object.
Yeah, in the AWS one, I mean, we'll probably move it to a secret at some point, but we stored a CA certificate, the top level one, which then Kubernetes uses to bring up the rest of the certificates without having to get SSH into nodes. That's like a really useful way to spin up machines, and should be stored at the cluster level. Like machines shouldn't really have access to that.
So it seems to me that all of these are provider-specific requirements, except for maybe the API endpoint.
And the network ranges. To me, that's pretty generic, right? Like everybody is going to want to say, here are the network spaces that my cluster is occupying. That's not
if you're EKS. I agree that's
maybe
that's borderline not worth arguing about.
Yeah, I haven't looked at how EKS does that too. Did they pick the network ranges for you?
I believe so. I guess my observation is that right now we have a dependence on the cluster object for the machine actuator, which I think is poor and we should get rid of. That's a tangential issue. But then when I look at the cluster object and what we use it for, the cluster registry cluster object also has the API endpoint. And so I feel like I don't see a lot of additional value yet. So to Lucas's question, I think we should minimize how much we put there. And my observation, right, is that right now there's almost nothing necessary there. So.
Cool. That's good information. Last question. We have 2 minutes left. What's the release status? How far have we come? Can we like do, say, here is alpha 1 and tag it 0.0.1.0 in December at the same time that Kubernetes 1.13 is released?
What's the value of trying to synchronize that with the Kubernetes release? So we had a discussion about this yesterday during the SIG meeting that you missed, where we were talking about release notes and release cadence, and Justin said that it was actually really useful for COPS to be detached from the Kubernetes release process, because then when COPS said, now we have support for 1.13, people actually trusted that had been validated and were willing to use it, right? And if we are arbitrarily saying, well, Kubernetes cut 1.13 today, we have to cut a cluster API that has 1.13 support, then our users are going to be confident that it's actually ready to be used, right?
Yeah. I'm not saying we should tie it to the Kubernetes release. I was just thinking, for marketing purposes, could we say, so I'm writing the Kubernetes to GA blog post, could we say that, well, we also have this more higher level spec. So Kubernetes has very small, in this case, scope. So Cluster Lifecycle has been working on this cluster level scope. Now it's perfect because Cluster API has released their first alpha version. You can try it out. It has these basic functionalities. We have a roadmap for looks like this, and Kubernetes GA, so any cluster provider can use it easily and leverage both tools. That's my question.
I think that's absolutely the right positioning for like Kubernetes versus Cluster API, and like, Kubernetes is going GA, but like doesn't have some of the cluster level concepts, but then like point to the Cluster API. I think that makes a ton of sense. I don't know if we need it to be alpha by then. I don't know if it would like a fake alpha, right? Or like a
right. So I was thinking more from marketing. Is there anything like blocking us from tagging a git tag, saying this is alpha, here is the current state, try it out?
No, I mean, I think the thing about try it out, though, is you can't just take the cluster API repo and try it, right? You actually have to go to the provider implementation repo and try it there. So if we just tag cluster API as alpha, that doesn't actually help users because they're going to say, how do I use this? Oh, I follow the link to the AWS provider and use that. But oh, is it tagged to alpha also? Like, what's its release cadence? Is it ready to be used? Or I go to GCP, the same questions I go to any of the other implementations, right? So I think that's sort of a complicating factor there too.
True, but just like from the perceived stability, or like perceived progress things, like we started this year ago. We now have a lot of community like tools around implementations around this. Is there anything that blocks us from saying we alpha 1? This is what we got. We release 0.1.0 with the alpha 1. Next version is going to be alpha 2 when we find a lot of breaking changes we maybe need to make. So and that is more my question. Like, could we, for the user's perceived yes, yeah, for that, for more marketing purposes than like technical ones.
Yeah, what's the date for that? Is it like December 5th ish?
I think it's later, but I don't know. I have to check. Yeah, but it's like 1 or 2 days after the 1.13 release.
That's about which date you guys are talking about?
Kubernetes 1.13.
So the release is on the 3rd of December, to my knowledge.
Okay, cool. So mid-December, yep.
And that's a great point. Let's. Can you open an issue about that, and we can maybe try to continue the discussion on an issue or in Slack?
Yeah, I'll try to do so. Cool. I'll have to go.
Yes, and with that, it's 11. I think everyone should probably be moving along to their next appointment. Thanks for showing up. We had actually a lot more to discuss today than I thought we would, and this has been great. I won't be here next week. I will find someone else to chair the meeting, and I will see everyone else in 2 weeks. Here.
Bye.